What's up, my fellow light lover? Whether it's your first interview or your 100th, every location brings its own unique set of challenges. So in this video, I'm going to cover 7 areas that I consider when working with a DP to light a cinematic on-location interview. Before we touch any lights, the first decision that we should make is where we want to place our subject. We'll base everything else around the framing that results from this decision, so it's important that we try to get this correct to save time. While every location is different, there are some guidelines that I see DPs follow when placing a subject to guarantee a cinematic framing. The first rule of thumb is to pull the subject away from the wall and move them towards the center of the room. Distancing the subject from the wall does 2 things. First, there's a natural softening to the background in camera because our talent and our background are now on different focal planes. Secondly, this separation helps the lighting tech, or you, control the intensity over different areas of the frame more easily. The key light will now provide light to just our talent, rather than affect them and the wall with the same intensity. This is due to a rule called the inverse square law, which I'll cover later in this video. Now that we've placed our subject, where do we put the camera? Well, for the most depth, try shooting towards a corner rather than flat into a wall. Shooting at an angle like this can also be a good way to add leading lines to the subject. Use a counter, a shelving unit, or some other on-location item to draw the viewer's eyes from the edge of the frame towards the subject. Our last consideration is if the subject will be speaking to camera or looking off camera. If they're speaking to camera, place the subject in the middle of the frame. And if they're going to be looking off camera, place them on a third line so they have a little extra space in front of where they're going to be looking. This feels more natural than if you have significant negative space behind them instead. Before I describe when to use hard or soft lighting, let's define what hard or soft light even means. The softness of a light refers to how distinct the transition from light to shadow areas is. A hard light casts shadows with a distinct cut between the lit and shadow areas, and the more gradual this transition, the softer we consider the light. In theory, there's really only one variable that affects the softness of a light, and it's that light's size relative to the object that it's lighting. The larger a source compared to the subject, the softer the light will appear. One important note is that when a light from any type of source comes into contact with diffusion, that diffusion becomes the new source. And this is why filmmakers put things like softboxes and larger rags in front of their lights. A loose rule of thumb that I like to use for determining when to use soft or hard light during an interview is that soft light is for faces, hard light is for spaces. Soft lighting on our talent flatters their skin by reducing the appearance of imperfections like bumps, blemishes, pores, and etc. As for hard lighting, I'll mention towards the end of the episode how I use it to keep viewers interested in watching. Alright, it's finally time to place a light. First up is the key light, or the main light that we're going to use to light our subject. This is also the light that will provide the most shape to our subject's appearance, impacting how our audience emotionally connects with them. There's 4 things to consider when placing a key light. First, height matters. Light coming from below a subject gives a spooky campfire, Tales from the Crypt Keeper vibe. And while this works for some narrative projects, I'm willing to bet it definitely won't work for pretty much all of your interview setups. If we raise the light a little and point it directly into our subject, we get a very flat deer caught in the headlights look. But what light are we trying to mimic with our key light? The one that's been with us our whole lives, the sun. And where is the sun? Usually above us, except you Australians. Which is why a key light placed above our talent looking down at them from a slight angle is the most natural feeling placement. Usually somewhere between like 30 and 45 degrees is a good angle to aim for. When the subject is speaking to camera, like I am now, then there's only one more thing to consider when placing the key light, and that's where it will be placed around the subject. Let's start with the key light directly in front of our talent, and what's called frontal lighting. The advantage of frontal lighting is that it very evenly lights the subject, fills in blemishes and skin imperfections, but we also get a pretty flat look on our talent because there isn't any shadows creating depth. By beginning to rotate the light around our talent, we cast shadow patterns, helping to add shape to the face. If we stop at a 3/4 angle, 45-degree angle, however you'd like to refer to it, we now get what's a very classic look known as Rembrandt lighting. Look for the little triangle of light underneath the shadow side eye, and that's how you'll know that you've dialed this look in. Continuing to rotate the light around our subject, and we end at side lighting, which is a very moody look that adds a lot of drama to the interview subject. All three of these looks have their time and place. Maybe we're lighting a soft, airy, high-key piece using talent with a lot of wrinkles or texture to their face. Well, then frontal lighting might not be too bad, so we don't exaggerate their age or complexion with shadows. But maybe the piece is a candid bio about all the trials and hardships this same person went through. Then in this case, maybe frontal lighting isn't the best, and a 3/4 light that helps to highlight their facial texture is a little better to the story. Maybe this subject is the villain in our documentary, and we want to mimic their duplicitous nature with some side lighting. Direct-to-cameras aren't the only way that we interview subjects though. Often, we'll have our subjects looking off camera. In this case, there's one more thing to consider when placing our key light, and that's whether we're going to use a near or a far side key. Near versus far refers to where a key light is in relation to both the line of sight of the subject and the placement of the camera. A near side key is placed on the same side of the line of sight as the camera. A far side key is placed across the line of sight from the camera. Pretty much every shot in every film you've ever watched uses a far side key because the created shadows add dimension and shape to the image, and a near side key gives a much flatter, washed out image. So it should come as no surprise that I recommend using a far side key whenever the location allows for your interview setups. There's one final consideration for key light placement, and let's talk about how to reduce a sourcey looking key light. Sourciness happens because of a thing called the inverse square law, which states that as the distance between the light and the subject is doubled, the intensity of the light hitting the subject is reduced by 1/4. Here's what this bunch of words looks like as a visualized graph. If we zoom into the first few feet of this graph, notice that the line slopes downward quickly. What this means for us filmmakers is that the difference in brightness between these first few feet is rather dramatic, up to about 8-ish feet or so. And this is the amount of separation between light and subject that really emphasizes sourciness. So to achieve a non-sourcey look, it's best to have our lights at least a few feet away from the subject that they're lighting. That was a lot to take in, but let's go even deeper. Since we were looking at the graph for point sources, and most key lights go through some type of diffusion, let's see what that fall-off curve looks like. Here's the corresponding graphs for larger soft sources using 6x6, 12x12, and 20x20 rags. As we can see, the fall-off from a softer source is less dramatic at the start compared to a point source, but the inverse square law still applies after you've reached a distance equal to the greatest diagonal of a source. So for 6x6, that's at about 9 feet or so, and for 12x, that's 17 feet. Identifiable on both the point source and the 6x6 graph, the key part of them both is this area around the 8-foot space. From roughly 8 feet on, the amount of light fall off per feet of separation begins to flatten out. So if we position our subjects about 8 feet or so from our key light, you can see that the light hitting across their whole body is going to be more equivalent than if I position the key light just out of frame. Of course, if you remember from earlier in the video, backing a key light up is also going to reduce its apparent size to the subject, which will reduce its softness. So in order to have the same softness at 8 feet that I did at 4 feet, I'll need to use a bigger softbox, which is one of the reasons why so many diffusion options exist. I know I just covered a lot, so let's recap what to consider for a key light. First up, verticality matters. Try to have the light coming from above your subject rather than straight at your subject, and definitely not from below. Number 2, start with a Rembrandt angle and adjust from there depending on the mood or the subject. Number 3, use a far side key when possible, which is always. Number 4, reduce sourciness by increasing the distance between your diffusion or your light source and the subject. Traditional 3-point lighting setups would put a light here, but I almost never do that. How do I get away with it? Well, I've found that a much easier way to control the contrast between the light and shadow side of a subject's face is by using some form of bounce. Depending on your budget level, this can be anything from a white sheet from Walmart to a 5-in-1 reflector to a beadboard or even a larger rag setup. What the bounce does is redirect light from the key light toward the subject's face. In order to control the amount of light hitting the shadow side, I can position the bounce closer to them for more light or further away for less. Once I've achieved the proper ratio between the light and the shadow side of my subject's face, I can freely adjust the intensity of the key without affecting this ratio, saving us a bit of time during setup. Of course, no 3-point light setting is complete without some light providing separation to the subject from the background. And my favorite way to do this is with 2 lights. I'll boom one light in horizontally behind my talent as a hair light, and then set up the other one on the opposite side of my key for a kicker. There's 2 things that I pay attention to when positioning the hair light. The first is I want to make sure the subject doesn't shine anywhere on their forehead, particularly this widow's peak area. If this happens, I'll either pull the light back until the light isn't hitting that spot of their head, or reduce the intensity of the light to reduce the apparent shininess if they don't have a lot of hair in general. The other thing that I want to achieve with the positioning of my hair light is to have both the subject's head and shoulders approximately the same distance away from the hair light. I do this because of that old inverse square law. I want to reduce the apparent sourciness of the light so their hair isn't noticeably brighter than their shoulders. The second light I like to set up adds separation to my subject on their shadow side and is what's known as a kicker light. This light provides a highlight on the shadow side cheek, an extra separation on the shoulder, both of which help to keep the subject from falling off into darkness on the shadow side of their body. At a conceptual level, this light also helps to provide alternating lines of light and dark on the image, a composition which helps retain viewer interest longer than a flatly lit image. Once we start to get a few lights up in a space, they'll often start bouncing around and interacting with our scene in unwanted ways, like visible reflections or increasing the background intensity, weird shadows, etc. The easiest way to control most of this unwanted spill is to place a modifier called a grid onto our lights. Grids reduce the beam angle of a light or modifier from a wide open spread to usually around 50 degrees. And by placing these on our lights, we can control the directionality of them while still retaining the soft quality. Sometimes though, a grid still doesn't keep enough light from spilling onto the background. And in this case, I'll need to pair using a grid with a technique called feathering to get the control that I really want. In order to feather a key light, I'll first place that light where I want it to be, far side Rembrandt angle, and initially I'll point it directly at the talent. But, and here's where the magic happens, then I'll slowly begin to rotate the light away from the background of my frame. I rotate it until either I've isolated my talent from the background or have started to lose exposure on my talent, then I bring the light back just a little. Using this technique helps me control separate parts of the frame with individual lights, giving me the ability to brighten or darken those areas at will. The other tools that I keep handy to control the spill of light when grids won't do the job are multiple sizes of flags, from 18 by 24s to 2 by 3s to 4 by 4s to even just giant sheets of duvetine. These control light by literally just blocking it and are always useful to have around. One of the most common ways I'm using these is when I'm spotlighting or Fresnelling towards talent or into set somehow, like off of a ceiling or a rear bounce card. Oftentimes these modifiers aren't perfectly aligned lensing systems, so there's a bit of a spill outside their normal throw area. I'll place a flag underneath the light to block the spill from affecting any part of the scene, And it's also night for talent, so they aren't looking at a super bright light. Finally, to retain viewer interest as long as possible, remember to light the whole frame and not just the subject. If you have the extra lighting available and your background is a little dark, you can control the intensity of the background by bouncing the light off the ceiling, into a wall, or just aiming it directly at the background sometimes. Yes, if that room is small enough, I can take the grid off my key light, have a little more spill into the background, and increase that intensity a little. But by placing the background and subject on different lights, I'm much more easily able to control the ratio between them to achieve the mood that I'm going for. Another way that I like to add interest is by using hard light in a scene. I'll usually add this as some form of scratch across the background, usually with a point source and a spotlight, but the same look can be achieved more inexpensively with a point source, fresnel, and some intentional flacing or flagging. Lastly, don't forget to add practicals to the frame. Practicals are lights that are visible in the frame, like table lamps, wall fixtures, monitors, or other existing lighting in the environment. These can make the frame more interesting by adding multiple color temperatures, enhance the alternating pattern of light and dark in the frame, and they add motivation to your hair and kicker lights. If you want to start lighting your own interviews but don't have your own lights, and you're curious which lights I recommend to buy first, go ahead and click this video. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. Thanks for watching. See you next time.